All right, everyone, welcome to session number 2 live with our week where we're focusing on effectively navigating conflict. This is a really important topic because the one thing that will always be true about life is that conflict will never go away. Whether it's in your personal life or your professional life, you are guaranteed to have conflict. And so, from an emotional intelligence perspective, I want to encourage you, first of all, if you fear conflict or you avoid conflict, it will create more conflict down the road. This whole exercise is meant to give you tips and tools to begin to face conflict with more confidence, being aware of who you are, what you're bringing to the table, what your role in the conflict is. I use the term effectively navigating conflict because when you think about conflict, we often hear managing conflict. The truth is that in conflict, there's another person or multiple people, and you will never be able to control them, predict them, or understand where they're coming from, their perspectives, their objections, their expectations. And so the only thing you can do in conflict is manage yourself and hold yourself accountable to your role in the conflict, whether you created it or not. And so I'm really excited to invite today's guests to share a little bit with us today about conflict. So first we have Michi. Michi is one of the founders of Recast Success, which is where I met John, actually. And her dedication to the customer success industry and helping individuals find their footing within the industry of customer success is really profound. So Michi, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Great to be
Yeah,
here.
really excited. And we have Christy. Christy, remind me the name of the company one more time.
Square.
Content Square. So Christy is VP of CS at Content Square, and they have combined forces with two other organizations, and she's in the midst of chaos and effectively navigating conflict on a regular basis. And so for her to be here and share her wisdom, Christy, I'm just so excited to have you.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Love it. All right. So my first question to both of you is the term or the word conflict. Most of us, when we hear that word, there's an emotion. We have a very specific idea of conflict. So, Michi, I'll start with you. When you hear the term conflict, what's going on inside?
Yeah, to be honest, I've grown a lot over the course of my professional life and personal life. Back in the day, I was very conflict avoidant. I was very non-confrontational. I always tried to kind of use a back door to figure out how to appease a situation or talk to someone to make sure that that person is not making another person upset anymore. Middle child, and I feel like as a middle child, I was always trying to help my mom not be mad at my sister and all of that. So I can remember specifically one time where I was holding thoughts in, not trying to share my thoughts with a fellow coworker. And in a meeting, I just snapped. And I was giving them feedback, which I thought was helpful. But then they turned around and told our manager that the way I gave feedback felt like an attack. I don't know how much of that was true, but ever since getting my manager involved, that I give feedback like an attack, I really needed to work on the way that I navigate conflict. And so I would say, over the course of the past 10 years since that incident happened, I have started to think of conflict more as a zero-sum game, and not as a zero-sum game. It's not if I give you feedback, then I win and you have to work on it. It's more, okay, let's try to understand the situation. I'll share my feelings, you share your feelings. Let's both be open-minded and let's work on a solution together where we're both happy. This has, evolved in my personal life, professional life, in my marriage with my kids. But I would say now when I hear conflict, I do think of it more as, okay, how are we going to figure this out? Less of, ooh, I want to avoid it at all costs because I know
love
it
that.
comes out in a very attack way if I avoid.
I think it's interesting you remember that incident, and I want to come back to that to dig in a little bit further. Christy, same question for you. When you hear conflict, what's the immediate response?
Yeah, the immediate response is still physical, even now where it's not real conflict. I think conflict, feedback, anything that I know is going to be in that realm. Like I do feel my shoulders tense. I feel my palms get a little bit sweaty. Um, but even despite being at a place now where I do feel very comfortable with conflict and actually, uh, sort of like Nietzsche said, I'm very appreciative, I think, for actually the positive outcomes that can come from conflict. Like,
Mm.
is always, I think, just a little bit of like fear or apprehension um, about conflict. I mean, even the word is so aggressive sometimes, right? Like
Yeah, that's
fighting.
true. Yeah.
Instead of, yeah, navigating through something, working through a problem together, which is much softer language. So, I mean, yeah, I try to recognize that still, even though I know how to approach conflict and I do feel incredibly comfortable with that, yeah, my first reaction is still negative in my body.
Me too. My stomach gets all bleh, and I get a tightness in my chest. And for me, conflict, I grew up in conflict. So in my household, my dad used to say, we don't go to bed angry ever. And so every night before bed, we would, as a family, be sitting down to talk about who has a problem. And we're going to talk about it. And so, from my perspective, my approach before EQ to conflict was, well, I'm right. So, you got to figure your part out. That was just how I operated. It wasn't until the catalyst of my life that I realized I had no clue how I was coming across. So, Michi, to your point, I'd been called aggressive, I'd been called combative, I'd been called all of these words. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, no, I'm trying to be helpful, but my filter was skewed. And so, it's taken me years to now when I hear conflict or I know that conflict is coming, Christy, to your point, I still feel it in my body, but I'm no longer afraid and I'm no longer coming in with this superiority complex that I'm right and it's all on the other person because, my part was innocent and honest. So Michi, I want to come back to your story because when you have a moment in your life that becomes a catalyst, meaning you were called this thing and it bothered you internally so much that you made a decision to pivot and shift. Can you talk us a little bit through that circumstance in more detail?
Yeah. So I remember this incident, there was buildup. So it was a couple months of buildup where I didn't say anything, I didn't say anything, I didn't say anything. And it was eating me inside. And my coworker had no idea what was going on, wasn't feeling this sense of like anger that I was feeling. And so when I finally did say something, I really regretted not saying something earlier because I could have turned something that was became an attack. I could have given that feedback in bite sizes and like really small things initially that wouldn't have felt like an attack. And so what I felt going forward was when there was something like you also don't want to be nitpicky and give people feedback all the time. Like every
Right.
single time I talk to you, like, by the way, change this, right?
Yeah.
And so the way that I thought about it was if I started to feel that ick inside of me towards someone that I was working with that I didn't like the way that we were working together, I would think about, okay, is this something that is on me? Is this really something that's on them? How could we try to fix this problem together? And then if I felt like the only way to solve it would be to not confront them, but to address it with them, how can I genuinely share how it's making me feel without it being like you're making me feel this way and like it being more of a complaint rather, hey, let's try
Mm,
to work better together and
yeah.
this is how I think we should do it. Would love to hear your thoughts or what are your feelings towards this situation too. And so I think it made me become a better cooperator overall.
I mean, so from the day that this event occurred and you had this trigger word that just you couldn't get over, you made a decision, I'm going to do things different. How did you begin to slowly change that approach? What do you remember doing anything specific or how did you
Yeah.
shift?
Yeah. Um, I do think that I had to, well, specifically with this coworker, we were going to continue working together. So, and what I realized is they weren't going to change actually. And so I needed to change the way that I was working with them because the the feedback didn't land. They were not self-aware of the way that they were working. And so I just kind of figured out, ways to work better with them was just to not work so closely with them, to be honest.
Mm.
And like I felt that that was a perfect solution because we continued to work together for a couple more years, but I just didn't volunteer on projects to work with them, and it actually made everyone much happier because I realized we just weren't compatible. But I also noticed other people in my company who I worked really, really well with, and what a relationship without conflict could feel like. And worked on giving feedback to people who took it differently, and worked on giving feedback with a lot of different people and not just this one person who didn't like the way that I gave feedback.
I just want to highlight a couple things you said, which are really profound. So first off, effectively navigating conflict does not mean a resolution that is happy for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because to
Mm-hmm.
your point, that other person wasn't going to change. And I love that you were able to recognize that and say, okay, well, I'm just not going to work with them anymore. You didn't really have that option. And so you found a peaceful resolution for both of you that didn't equate this intimate emotional relationship. So I want to highlight that that is going to be part of effectively navigating conflict, is recognizing when you have an impasse, but you can remain professional and respectful. And two, that you found strength in those relationships where you didn't have a ton of conflict and you leaned into those because it was good for both of you. And that's a really great balance to the situation. So I really love that.
Can I
Christy,
add one more thing?
yes,
Sorry.
please.
I
No,
do
you're good.
remember feeling so angered by that initial confrontation
Yeah.
that I was thinking, I can't even work at this company. Like, if I have to work alongside this person, I gotta go. And there were times where I was like, this is not fair. I tried so hard to get this job. Why am I letting them make me want to leave? And so that was also a consideration. It was I felt like this was not fixable so much to the point where I thought the only way for me to be happy at work was for me to leave because I couldn't work well with that person.
So what
Yeah.
brought you out of that mindset? Because I've been in similar circumstances where I'm like, forget it. This isn't worth it. I'm just gonna, jump ship. What led you to decide differently against that feeling?
Realizing there were so many other people that I worked so well with, and I didn't want to give up those relationships and let one person bring this whole situation down.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I love that. We talk a lot about how when you allow other people's behaviors, words, emotions change your commitment to yourself, who you are, and what you know to be true, and all the positives in your life, you're giving your power away, right? And one thing that is part of EQ is understanding I know who I am. I know what my commitments are. I know what my morals and values are. And no matter when I come into any circumstance or conversation, I'm coming in to stay respectful and kind. No matter how you respond, no matter how the conversation goes, I'm committed to my own um, persona of who I've decided I'm going to be. And I kind of love that, honestly, we've all probably been in a circumstance where the conflict was so bad that we want to quit. We want to give up. To your point, I've worked really hard to be here. It's not fair, right? I think all of us have had those experiences. And so I love that you took a different approach. That's another thing that we talk about, which is when you're in the midst of all that negative emotion, that is not the time to make decisions,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. All right. So, Christy, I'm going to come to you and ask you to share a story of conflict that maybe you effectively navigated or maybe you didn't. What are some things that you learned about yourself and how you manage conflict today?
Yeah. I'll share a story from a couple of years ago. So I got asked to work on a cross-functional project with a product manager to launch a new feature that we were specifically going to target to our existing customer base, which is why they wanted so much customer success input. But it immediately became clear in the start of that project that there was tension. Nobody was sort of clear who was the decision maker here. And we just had completely different priorities and different approaches to how we were looking to solve the problem that we were tackling. I was, of course, more focused on the customer insights that I had. And she seemed to be very focused on just speed and efficiency and getting to the deadline that had been set. So as we were having these weekly meetings with ourselves and then our subsequent teams, conflict immediately started to arise. So she definitely felt like I was slowing the process down and sort of asking irrelevant questions. And, I definitely felt like she wasn't taking into account what the customer needs were, and ultimately the revenue that we might make from this product if we didn't actually nail it and solve the problem that I felt our customers had. And after a couple of weeks, this sort of conflict eventually spilled over in front of the team, which is one of the things I'm most regretful about in this situation. And we sort of both walked out of there incredibly frustrated, not solving anything. So I was reflecting on it that night, probably all night. I'm sure I didn't sleep if I go back and think about that moment. And, sort of to your point, I recognize I can't control this other person. So I really started to think about what can I control in this situation? What's my part in this conflict? And I think recognizing a couple of things. So one, this was an incredibly unique situation for a product manager who typically have all of the control. Yes, they're, asked to take insight from others, but they're the clear decision maker. So that was definitely different for Sarah. And then also we hadn't actually talked about that and how we wanted to work together and what our unique priorities were. So thinking about that, the next day, went back into the office and actually asked if this product manager would grab coffee with me outside of the office, which I think was, hopefully helpful in that situation. And really just sat down to talk, started by acknowledging, the frustration that she's likely to feel and recognizing the things that I thought she was doing really well. So, I saw that it's super important to keep this on time. And also sort of apologized for the way that I had that disagreement with her in front of the team, and then just sort of shared my concerns in a much calmer place, like giving the perspective about why I was bringing some of the feedback I had. And through that conversation, I think she really opened up, started to sort of share back that she was feeling like an incredible amount of pressure from the deadlines. So our chief product officer actually didn't really want the company to be focusing on this feature at all and had been telling her to kind of do it as a CEO's project, right? All of this was conflict, or all of this was context that I didn't have. So she just sort of gave me the background about why she was pushing so hard for this and ignoring the feedback. And ultimately we came out of that conversation, I think, in a much better place, understanding each other. And we ultimately were able to kind of brainstorm a compromise. So prioritizing what, the top sort of customer concerns that I was bringing forward, presenting this back for leadership, and then slightly extending the timeline, but not much beyond our original goals. And ultimately the feature launched in those new goals, and we were able to generate quite a bit of revenue from our existing customer base. So I think the two valuable lessons in that story that were reinforced here was, I think, conflict often, not always, but often just stems from misalignment and assumptions we make about the other person and why they're taking the actions that they are. So I think it's incredibly important to take time to understand the why behind somebody else's actions. Often when we do that, again, you can build empathy or sympathy for what they're facing and find that you made actually a lot of assumptions about the actions that they were taking. And then again, if I could go back it was clear from the first session that that conflict was there. And I didn't address it with this product manager until, of course, it blew up in front of the team. So I think the other thing is always, when possible, is just addressing this early and directly, so that the tension doesn't build to the point where you're exploding on each other.
Yeah, so one, I want to highlight, you brought the conflict out of the setting in which it occurred. Conference room, building place that you worked, and most of us are remote these days, so we don't have that option. But I want to highlight that sometimes conflict requires removing yourself from the environment where the conflict occurred, because maybe the other person is triggered by the fact that other people are listening and paying attention. You don't know, right? So I love the fact that you brought it offline, basically, to have a one-on-one personal conversation. I also am curious, was there any part of you that was judgmental of her response? Because you're like, how on earth do you think that this is okay? Like for me, I know I look at other people that disagree with me, and there's judgment sometimes of like, how on earth is this okay to you? Do you know what I mean? Was there a part of that for you that existed?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And sometimes I think I've also felt frustration that why am I the one that's going to solve this conflict as well? And I would be lying
Yeah.
if I said I didn't sort of often look down on the other people and go at it with an approach of I'm going to be the bigger person and I'm going to be the one that's
Yeah.
going to solve this because you're clearly not. But again, recognizing that I'm sort of having those feelings. And um, one of my favorite conflict resolution frameworks is crucial conversations. And
Ah!
my biggest lesson from that is separating fact from stories. And I
Yes.
think in 99.9% of all conflict, I have definitely recognized that something happens and I tell myself a story about why the person did that. They clearly did this because they don't care about the success of the company.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that is probably my largest takeaway from that book. But yeah, I felt like I was doing that in this situation too. Is, well,
Yeah.
how could she possibly be making this decision? It's super clear that we're not actually gonna make money. But when it later became clear that she did care about that, but the pressure from her boss was this timeline and her feeling secure in her role, then again, it's like, oh, well, my story doesn't match up with why they were taking these actions. So
Yeah. I'm going to ask Michi to jump in here, because Michi, before you had this catalyst in your life, you kind of talked about you would avoid it, bury it. And I want to highlight, if you are not dealing with conflict on a regular basis, and you come from a place where maybe you didn't grow up dealing with conflict in your family, maybe you've learned a complete avoidance perspective because that's how you were raised. So from Christy's perspective, she's like, why am I the one having to deal with it? I just want the conflict to be resolved. I don't understand her position. And let's say it was Michi 15 years ago who's like, oh, I'm not going to deal with this because I don't like conflict and I'm going to completely avoid it. So I'm curious, Michi, what if someone listening to this call is where you were? They avoid conflict, conflict makes them uncomfortable, but conflict is part of their life right now. What advice, because I know we're going to lose you in a couple minutes, what advice can you offer to somebody who's struggling with conflict right now?
Yeah. So, it happens in life, in many things, where you tell your kid, put your shoes on nicely. Then you put your shoes on, and then you start raising your voice, put your shoes on, and then finally you go, and then they look at you and they're like, whoa, why did you scream at me? And what they're not realizing is that you are trying to be patient, trying to be patient, trying to be patient. And it's really hard for someone to just stay level headed time and time and again, time and again, time and again. And so if you start kind of start recognizing, okay, you're building up, it's really important to kind of let some air out, or else you're going to really blow up. So my advice is, when you start noticing these feelings in your body, to ask yourself, is there a different way I can be communicating this or handling this, or kindly, trying to shift gears, because I know that I'm going to get to a point where it's just going to come out really aggressively. Um, and that goes for all types of relationships. And I think it's really helpful to stay level headed by constantly letting a little bit of air out as it builds.
Yeah. Breathing exercises we've learned. So take the advice and keep breathing. Christy, any last minute words for the recording part of this?
Yeah, I always will echo that. I think one of the biggest tips is just pause and reflect. And I do this in my personal conflict, right? Is when I feel my partner and I starting to get really frustrated, recognizing, hey, I need to walk away for a second and try to get my emotions to come out of this. Um, and then I think one of my other favorite tips is separate the person from the problem. It's
I
not this
love that.
person that's often an awful person, but it's the problem that you're working through, which
Yeah.
is more often than not contributing to a lot of the conflict. So focus on the issue and not the assumptions or attributes that you're assigning to the other person in conflict with you. Can be very,
Yeah.
very helpful for toning down some of that emotion.
Yeah, I love that. And I will say too, to kind of wrap, remember that what you know to be normal is not someone else's normal. And if you have a blow up, I've had a blow up moment with somebody and they're like, well, I just don't want to approach you anymore because you clearly can't control your emotions. Don't assume the other of someone else. If they're not comfortable with conflict and they avoid conflict, you can pass judgment on that individual. And I want to encourage you to remember that they have moments where they're out of their depth as well, and they're doing the best that they can. And if you extend empathy, you extend kindness and mutual respect, and come to the place to say, I do want to work with you. I care about what we're doing. Let's figure out and come together because I'm going to forgive the behavior from you that made me uncomfortable or that I passed judgment on. And we learned about that this week is being quick to forgive, not because the other person needs absolution or it's going to magically fix everything, but because the negative emotions that you hold on to when you don't forgive someone for behavior that you've judged as inappropriate or hurtful or demeaning or whatever, it only leads to more conflict within yourself, right? So, I'm going to wrap the recording, but Michi, Christy, this is amazing. Thank you so much for your time again and for sharing your wisdom. I really love kind of how today's gone. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.